Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started here. It is 10 o'clock PST. It is great morning in San Francisco. I'm going to go ahead and check my mic, though, make sure that this is coming through, and it is, as you can hear from the echo. So let's go ahead and get started. Quick word of warning from everybody. My particular neighborhood has been experiencing a few internet issues. If we are lucky enough to have my internet drop, I will hop onto my phone. Then we'll break into a few ad hoc activities. The show will go on, but we may experience a little bit of cumbersome behavior there. So at any rate, let's go ahead and dive in. As you can see at the bottom of this first slide, there is a project which you can download. It's that bit.ly link at the bottom, so bit.ly/ULS. Again, it was already posted in the chat, so refer to the chat if you'd like the direct link. Now, this is only relevant if you do plan on following along with today's activities. That's a good move into what exactly we're going to be doing. I'll go over that in just a minute, but first, let's start with some introduction, so we don't have this ominous voice talking to you. Well, first of all, that's me. I'm Tim. I am the Director of Design and one of the Unity developers at Kairos XR. We are a Unity development agency specializing in occupational training, specifically occupational training and educational content, 3D, of course, virtual reality, augmented reality, and desktop 3D. Joining me today are some fantastic Unity developers as well. We have James, Brian, Nicholas, and Ethan. Excuse me, Ethan and Nicholas, I'm so sorry, I just noticed a mistake here. Those pictures are actually swapped. So the picture on the far right is Nicholas, and again, the second from the right is Ethan, so apologies there, guys. But they will be helping out with the chat. So we'll get to a bunch of questions, and they will be able to answer your questions as soon as you post them, or as soon as they can get to them, I should say. So what exactly are we going to be doing today? Well, starting from the top, first of all, what's so exciting here is how many familiar names we're seeing in the chat. I personally have been involved with this initiative for about a year and a half now. We've run dozens of these workshops, if not more, and we see a lot of repeat names, and hopefully repeat faces someday if we do the video thing. But for now, it's the names, which is really great for a few reasons. It's the cultivation community, and that's really what these events are about. That's what these workshops are here for, to give you direct access to Unity professionals, to QA support, so that we can accelerate your growth and your learning trajectory as much as possible. So to see those repeat names is fantastic. With that said, we also have a ton of new people. So big welcome to those who are just joining us for the first time. Big welcome back to those who are joining us from previous sessions. Those of us who have been here a few times now, very familiar with this slide. But for those who are just joining us, again, the way that these session outlines typically work is there is a little bit of pre-work. We'll go over that pre-work, given that that was homework to a certain degree assigned through Unity Connect and the Learn platform. And this particular session is focusing on cinematography in Unity. So we are going to focus on these two tools, Cinemachine and Timeline. Those are the two primary tools used, or the most popular tools used when it comes to creating cutscenes in Unity and other cinematic shots as well. So it makes sense if we're focusing this session on cutscenes to start with those two tools. Now, as you can see from the time allocation, the majority of this session will revolve around activities. We have 3 exercises, but we're really going to dive into this first exercise, given that we're seeing a lot of feedback around the folks in the audience today, around being relatively new to Unity. So these sessions are valuable whether you're brand new to Unity or if you've been working in Unity for a while. If you're already an expert with Cinemachine and Timeline and you're very familiar with creating cutscenes, I will give you a warning. This is a beginner-friendly workshop. So we may be covering quite a bit of redundant and foundational material. But with that said, you still have access to QA. So feel free to drop those questions in there and we'll get to them regardless if they're relevant to the activity as soon as we can. So we'll spend the majority of the time working together in these activities, building out this cinematic short around a rocket taking off into space. And then we'll wrap up. We're gonna leave about 5 to 10 minutes in the end to hit all your questions that are still existing, and then talk about next steps, other workshops that are coming in. So a few additional resources for you. I already mentioned Unity Learn. Unity Learn Yes, I am seeing a few comments there in regards to the size of the file. Apologies. Let's get that going as soon as possible because it is a 1.5 or 1.6 gig file. Again, it's a big one, but it has some pretty cool assets, which is that's how we justify it. So at any rate, Unity Learn is the learning platform with all of the educational content that you would ever need and ever want, in addition to other resources, all in one place. So check out Unity Learn if you're interested in continuing your educational journey. Secondly, Unity built up a social platform to help foster community. Unity is all about community. So if you're interested in connecting with other like-minded individuals and professionals, definitely check out the Learn Live page on the Connect. Unity Connect is the platform. And again, I'm going to reiterate it one time. Let's get those assets downloading so you have plenty of time given that it is relatively large. So I mentioned that we're going to be working together. So let's hit a few more housekeeping items, and then we'll go ahead and just dive right into the activity. So I'll be working in 2019.3. I have tested the project. It works well. Originally, the project was built in an earlier version of Unity, so you will have to hit OK on a few messages that pop up to approve the version switch. And in addition, oops, you can see another typo here. However, we'll be working in cutscenes 2019.3. And if you have any questions, if you look at the bottom here, this QA, you'll notice that there's a QA feature at the bottom of Zoom. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop your questions in the QA rather than the chat, because the chat is typically overflowing with a bunch of enthusiasm and other forms of communication, mentioning that they have gotten through and ready to move on, or if you'd like us to slow down, drop that into the chat. If you have a question about the assets, any technical issues, any miscellaneous questions about the topics, go ahead and drop those in the QA feature. A few core questions that we're going to hit today. What exactly are blend cameras? How do we create a camera shake effect, like you're holding a camera in your hand? How might we swap skyboxes in a cutscene, right? So if there's a transition from the Earth environment to the space environment, how do we swap the skyboxes there? How do we make a camera follow a target object with his look at effect? Anybody who's familiar with cinematography may be familiar with the concept of a dolly and a track. So guys, these are some of the topics that we're going to hit today. If you are pretty familiar already with all of these topics, well, again, stick around. I'm sure you'll learn something. And again, use that QA function so we can answer any of your questions. If all of these are foreign, then you're in a fantastic place because we're going to cover all of them. A few more groundwork points here, and then we're going to dive in, I promise. Typically, I move quickly. All of the different instructors involved with this have a different style. I typically move relatively quickly in the beginning, but then I loop back around. So you'll see me walk through the project. You'll see me work through the exercise, but then we're going to loop back around a second time, and we're going to work through it together, covering the major points so we can move slower together. And then finally, I'll give you a few minutes and a little bit of space to work on it yourself. So I do, we do, and then you do. All right, so before we dive in, I just want to make sure, if there are any questions, go ahead and ask. We're seeing a few questions here. The slide's going to be available. All of the recordings will be posted afterwards, just as a heads up. And if you happen, it looks like we're getting a post-processing error. I actually didn't see that. See if you can hit play, and if we can circumvent that. If not, it looks like you'll need to re-download the post-processing package there, but we'll get to that. That's an example of a technical question that one of our fantastic TAs will follow up and work with you with. So many of us who've been following Unity for a while remember a few years ago when Unity came out with this example video of the rendering power of Unity, but also the cinematography power of Unity. Again, I'm streaming this, so it's going to come through a little glitchier than I'd like. However, it does exemplify, and you'll have this video after, the power of Unity's real-time rendering, in addition to Timeline, the sequencing tool, and Cinemachine, to create some of the handshaking effects and the following effects that we see in this video. Unity's moving heavily into the enterprise space. We have automotive as a very, very big topic. in terms of using Unity outside of the gaming space. And this is an example of the photorealism that you can achieve with Timeline, Cinemachine, and HDRP. If you're interested in high quality graphics, come to the next session, which is Thursday. My colleague Andy Jesvar, awesome Unity developer, he's going to be running that session on graphics, getting started with HDRP. Within this video, we saw a lot of different areas in Cinemachine. We saw something called a group target. We saw some blending. We saw the zoom and the follow feature. We saw quite a bit of noise for that camera shake. We also saw quite a bit of signaling. So Timeline uses timeline signals to call methods from scripts. And these are some of the topics that we're going to hit today. So you may not be able to build something of this quality at the end, but you'll have all the tools to be able to build at this quality, short of the high fidelity until you know HDRP. So let's go ahead and set up that project. First, we're going to take about 30 seconds here to review what the heck we're actually going to do. I mentioned that we are going to be creating a quick short of a rocket taking off. These are just some free assets, space assets on the Unity store, owned by Unity. And as you can see in the video, this is the project that we're ultimately going to build, or rather move towards, time permitting. You can see that we have the fade, that nice fade over the camera. We see the camera angle changing at different points as well. You can see particle system going on and off, that water, but also that smoke. So the smoke is a particle system. We see fire, it's a particle system. And then you have a scene change, or rather we have an environment change. New assets spawn. The skybox changes, as you can see. And this whole time, as you can see, we're changing the camera angle. So that's what we're going to achieve and learn how to do today. We want to be able to achieve the cinematic effects, the slow moving, the panning. Panning is the word I was looking for. The panning across the shot there. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and walk through the project. I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me. We are going to hop over to the project so we can see. We're going to do a little walkthrough here so we can get our bearings. I like to work in a default. That's, oops. Reshare. The default scene is typically where a lot of people enjoy working. And let's zoom in on our cameras. Cool. So as you can see, we have our scene here. We have a rocket. And at this point, I've downloaded the package and I've opened it up in Unity version 2019.3.7. Okay? If you are in the main scene, and we're going to create our own scene in just a moment, but if you're in the main scene, you can see something called the Environment Manager, which holds a reference to the target skybox, that second skybox, the Milky Way. You can see a few timelines. Again, timeline for those just getting started with Unity. And by the way, guys, if you're just getting started with Unity, treat this session as exposure. Don't get overwhelmed or don't get worried that there's just so much content and you're not going to retain anything. Because when you're just getting started with Unity, it's all about exposure and familiarity, so you are aware of which tools are out there and how to use them. Versus once you have a Unity foundation, that's when you can start moving towards mastery. And then that's when you can really dive into these tools. So back to the point here, we have a few timelines. You can see the playable director. And if we open up the timeline window, if we go into Window, Sequencing, Timeline, and pull that down to the bottom because it is a linear tool, we can see the different timelines that we will use to create this short. Again, this timeline in particular activates this massive Earth, but at that point, it also activates another rocket moving away from Earth, another to activate Mars. But this first one is really the core of today's activity. We're going to, well, let's see what we're going to do. If we hit play, we'll see if we get any jitters. You can see at the bottom, we're moving through our timeline, and we're using Cinemachine cameras, a very particular type of camera called a virtual camera, and we'll explain how that's used in just a moment, to change the position. We have an activation track to activate the particles. You can see we drop back there, and you can see the shake, and that shake effect we'll use, and then we follow the rocket up. And you can see, guys, the point, what's the point here? The point is that this entire first scene is done with one timeline. We can achieve quite a bit of storytelling just with one timeline by, we're going to pause there, just by adding a few virtual cameras, a few activation tracks, and a few animation tracks. So hopefully at this point, you also came to our last session on timeline. And timeline is, obviously, it's a very important tool here. I ran that session as well. Shortly after that, we had one on Cinemachine, and now we're combining the two. So if you came to those, these tools should be very similar or very familiar. If you didn't, it's okay. We'll bring you up to speed. So again, go ahead and open up this project, download it, and open it up in 2019. As one last foundational point here, to download Cinemachine in future projects, you need to go to Asset Manager, or excuse me, Package Manager. You'll find Cinemachine available to install rather than update. We're not going to update anything right now because that might blow up a project. Typically, you don't want to update things willy-nilly without a backup, that is, so don't update it, but typically you would have an install button there to bring it into your project. So let's go ahead and set everything up. Open up a new scene. Let's call it Demo Cinemachine. Let's Cinema Cutscenes. The name doesn't matter. But what we will do here, guys, is we will open up now, we'll go into our Scenes folder, and let's go ahead and open up our main scene. Just drag it in so we can open up both scenes at one time. Go ahead and select Earth Objects. You know what? We're just going to do that. We're going to do Earth Objects and Saturn V Takeoff. Control C to copy, or Apple C to copy if you're on a Mac, and then Control V or Apple V to paste it into your other scene. And let's go ahead and unload that for now. You can save it, but either way, we'll continue to have a quick access to the scene, even though it's unloaded. But now we have everything that we need here. And guys, also, if you want the same aesthetic, go ahead and pull the post-processing in too. So now we have everything. We have everything, including a camera. If we look at the camera is completely out of place. So the first step here to set up our project is to find our starting position for the camera. And it doesn't actually matter because the virtual cameras, as we will go over soon, displaces and changes the position of our camera. An important takeaway here, though, is how do you quickly position the camera? When you're creating cinematic shorts, it's really important to have very precise control over your camera. And you can see that I'm moving around the scene here just by hitting my mouse, right click, and WASD, or WASD. I can move around the scene. And now if I hit Control-Shift-F, I can snap the camera to my scene view here. So now we have our camera looking at the rocket. Again, may not be super relevant right now, but it will be very relevant when we're placing the virtual cameras. The last point I'd like to make here is Cinemachine. Now, where exactly do we access the different tools that Cinemachine provides? The answer is up here. Once you download the package, you will have a Cinemachine dropdown in your nav bar, and you have all of these different types of cameras and tracks. We're not going to bore you with all of these different, with definitions of all of these. Cinemachine is way too deep to define every single tool within the Cinemachine package without having legitimate application. So once we start using these, that's when we'll go ahead and we'll define these as we go. But just know that the takeaway here is that once you import Cinemachine into your project, you'll have access to all of these cameras. Great. So I'm going to go back to our presentation so we can start going over a few definitions. And then we're going to hop right back in here, and then we're going to start putting together the first part of our scene. So at this point, hopefully you downloaded and uncompressed today's package and you open it up. I mentioned that we've had a few workshops specifically revolving around timeline and Cinemachine. From the timeline workshop, you'll notice that the control track, the activation track, the animation track, and the timeline signal, these are all topics that we went over in those particular workshops. And again, the recordings are available, so you will have a chance to go over them again. If you were here for the Cinemachine workshop, you should know that we went over virtual cameras, blending, dolly track noise, look at and follow. Great. So we're going to be hitting those specific topics to build out the entire cutscene today. And the first scene that we're going to work, the first chunk, the first activity or challenge that we're going to do is just setting up the rocket takeoff. So you'll see in this far right, the rocket's about to take off. It ignites, and then it's going to take off from the platform. And we're going to do just that with the timeline. So the step-by-step here is create a timeline takeoff sequence. Within that timeline, activate the particles and animate the rocket so it takes off. And we're going to dedicate, we're going to dedicate 9 minutes to this challenge. It's going to be a fast challenge. Always do that. All right, so the first step here is to create that timeline. So go ahead and create a new empty game object, rename it to timeline, and make sure that you have your timeline window open. Window, sequencing, timeline. And let's just create a new timeline. We'll call it demo takeoff timeline. We'll remove this animator track. Why? Because the default when you're creating a timeline is Unity thinks that you're animating the object to which you applied the playable director component, which is how timeline actually activates and works. So we can delete that. And just says, again, a little more housekeeping, hit the lock button, and switch the timeline from frames to seconds. And let's say we want the whole takeoff sequence to be 10 seconds, and we want to animate the rocket. So go ahead and pull Saturn V takeoff 1 into an animation track, just drag it into this gray box. And again, what are we doing right now? We just want the rocket to take off. We want the rocket to move from the platform into orbit. So how do we make it move from A to B? We animate it with an animation track. So let's go ahead and hit the recording, click on Saturn V again, and add a key for the position so that it locks in the position at the beginning of our timeline. And we agreed that we want the entire takeoff sequence to be 10 seconds, not that much. So let's zoom out, and let's just drag up the rocket to its final position after 10 seconds. And we can see if it's working. We can test if it's working because we have the takeoff here. Awesome. Cool, guys. So now, let's save that, and let's turn off the recording. And what's the next step? If we remember from the presentation, the next step is to shoot the water out, because in real life, when you have a rocket launching, you have a bunch of sprinklers going onto it, or a little more than a sprinkler, it's actually hoses. So we have a particle system or a few particle systems to do just that. So let's go ahead and find out. We have water particles here. By default, they're all activated. But we want these off by default, so let's toggle those off, and let's drag them into an activation track. So now, when we scrub through, we can't see it because it's in preview, but now we'll turn those water particles on at the beginning of this timeline, and they'll play through the entire takeoff. Cool. Okay, so something interesting happened here. You may notice that, or you may be thinking, okay, well, this is great, but the water particles are going to turn on right at the same time as the rocket takes off, which isn't very accurate, right? If you were making a demo reel for a game or for a proof of concept, industrial design proof of concept, or whatever it may be, you would want the sprinklers to turn on first, and then the ignition for the engines, and then you see the fire and the smoke and all that, right? So clearly you need to offset the water particles. So how can we now amend our animation so that the rocket takes off after the particles start. Well, we can do it in a few ways. We can double click. We can double click on that. We can actually adjust the keyframe itself. So if we were to move that now, the keyframe will update. But I don't love that. I don't love it for a few reasons. One, now we're in the keyframe world, and the whole point of timeline is that it's supposed to keep us away from the actual animation window. It's supposed to be an easy sequencing animation tool. So let's stay out of that. And instead, let's use the power of timeline and convert the animation track to a clip track. And now, because it's been converted to a clip track, again, I converted it by right-clicking on the animation track. Go back. There you can see the adjustment there. By right-clicking on the animation track, the window that pops up has this convert to clip track option. And let's drag it until after 3 seconds. And now, let's see, we're going to have a bunch of smoke particles. Naturally, we can't see because of all the smoke, but the particles will turn on. So we can actually turn off, all of these particles here to get a closer look. There we go. You can see very small, but you can see that the particles have now activated, and then the rocket takes off. And again, we can see that because we turned off the pre-liftoff particles and then the liftoff particles. All right, guys, so as a last step before we hop into Cinemachine, let's make sure that these pre-liftoff particles start shortly after the sprinklers. So let's drag the pre-liftoff particles into their own activation track. Same kind of a deal. And let's make sure the liftoff particles start when the rocket starts to lift off. So we're going to add another activation track. And we'll do that second floor. Where am I getting these numbers? Guys, it's not necessarily super exact. There's quite a bit of artistic expression here. So you don't need to be super precise with where you place these in this context. Naturally, we do want to have quite a bit of precision, especially for following somebody else's creative direction. And we can very precisely place these in the clip timing in the inspector. So let's go ahead and make sure that these particles stay on, especially the lift-off particles. Leave as is, so we'll keep them active, but just double check. We'll make them active in the post-playback state. Let's actually keep these, let's drag and extend the activation track here all the way to the end. So now, what we'll see, and we're going to stay in the scene view to test this. Cool. So we have the smoke, but then the smoke deactivates. That's okay. And it takes off, and we're there. So we have officially created our first timeline. Let's go ahead. We'll pause there for just 2 minutes. We're going to go back to the presentation, then we're going to dive into the next part, which is using Cinemachine. So again, now it's time for you guys to do a little catch-up. Let's make sure that you're asking any questions that you have. Let's dive deeper into our own projects and make sure we're still following along. There aren't any conceptual leaps we need to work through together. And we're going to work on this challenge until 10:30 PST, so in exactly 2 minutes. So we're getting a few questions here. We are getting a few messages as well. We'd like to slow down a little bit. I hear you. No problem. I'll I'll cool it. Pump on the brakes a little bit so we can work through this a little more methodically together. So no problem. Now, we do have a question. Is it possible for the particles to be disabled more smoothly? Yes, it totally is. The particles can fade out. The particles can continue to persist as well until their natural time expires. In this particular case, because we're moving quickly, we don't want to dive into the particle systems quite yet. But long story short is absolutely when the particle system turns off, there is a parameter in there that makes the particles persist again until they've expended their life. All right, we also do quite a bit of polling here, people. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a poll. It's just a little gut check. Actually, I wanted to do this in the beginning, but I want to check the audience here. We have a little over 140 people joining us, which is fantastic. I would love to hear from all of you. How familiar are we with Cinemachine and Timeline? Sweet. Looks like the number is still going up. Okay, so it looks like we don't quite have a bell curve. It looks like the majority of people here are relatively unfamiliar with it. So that's great. That's really great to know, because I'm also going to push you to the other workshops where we dive deeper into both of these tools. So again, today's goal for those of us who are, somewhere between a 1, 2, and 3 is just exposure. All right. And then for those of us who are 10, 9, and 8, especially the 9s and the 10s, reach out to me, because maybe you can teach us next time. Because it sounds like there are quite a few of us who work in this almost every Unity project, if every Unity project, which is sweet. You get the power of it. Awesome. You guys will find as well, it's like Unity's so fun and so fulfilling to work with. And Cinemachine is just a perfect example of that. I mean, it's like the perfect manifestation in terms of a Unity tool of like the essence of Unity. It's just super fun to work with. But alas, fun is over. Let's go ahead and dive into Challenge 2. The Challenge 2 is the blast off cameras. Sorry for the vernacular there. I wish I could use something a little more sophisticated than blast off cameras. But long story short is we're going to set up our camera angles. We're going to use Cinemachine to do so. You can see here that the camera is moving from different points of the rocket. It's moving up the shaft. It's moving across the bottom engines. It's following the rocket as it moves up as well. Actually, scratch that. That's just my mouse in the top GIF there. But we will create that effect, I promise you. So we're gonna do just that right now. So let's go ahead. I'm gonna slow down, but I'm also going to take us the first few steps here. So we're going to go over the basics of Cinemachine right now. I mentioned there's something called a Cinemachine virtual camera. Okay, so what exactly is a Cinemachine virtual camera? It's actually not. It's not a camera. It's a waypoint, and it's a point of data telling the real camera, the Unity scene camera, what to do. So I think I noticed somebody with commenting on the post-processing, which is actually not in this scene, but at any rate, so when we add a virtual camera, you'll notice that once we add that virtual camera, it's a Cinemachine asset, we're going to have something automatically added to the main camera called the Cinemachine brain. And the Cinemachine virtual cameras, the virtual cameras are responsible for telling the camera what to do, but the brain is responsible for actually making the camera do that target behavior. So let's go ahead and just dive right into it. So how do we add a virtual camera, that first point of data defining the behavior for a camera? Well, it's as simple as going to Cinemachine and then create virtual camera. Guys, Cinemachine it's deep. You have so many nuances. You have so many tools at your disposal to create every kind of effect you could ever want, cinematic effect that is. But the majority of the stuff that you can build can be done with just just virtual cameras. And that's what's really nice about it. Cinemachine is both beginner friendly in that you can do an amazing amount of stuff with virtual cameras, or you can dive really deep and you can try all this other stuff. The majority of today is just going to stay on virtual cameras. So right now we've added the virtual camera, and you should have this icon, this Cinemachine brain icon added to your main camera. And if you look at our camera, you'll see the Cinemachine, lo and behold, is added. Great. So now what can we do? Well, let's first of all just find this camera. And it looks like it was added right where our scene was. So that is a good point. So it looks like as we move our scene around, actually that may have been added right on our camera. Don't want to delete that. So as we move our scene view around, we can now position, remember that trick, that Control-Shift-F trick, to find starting points for the cameras. So again, the first goal here is to create that pan effect, right? So we have the starting point for the virtual camera, and then let's duplicate it so we have another virtual camera. And with that duplicate, the CMVCam1 selected, let's go ahead and adjust its position. So now we have two virtual cameras, as we can see. Awesome. So now we're going to create another timeline. The question is, how do we create the effect so that our main camera moves from one point to the next, interpolates between the two. But we actually need to create another timeline. So let's create an empty. Let's call it master timeline. You guessed it, create master timeline timeout. We're just going to call it demo master timeline to keep it separate. Let's do the house cleaning. So delete the animation, switch it to seconds, and then lock the timeline. All right, and this is where things get a little crazy, because instead of using an animation track or an activation track, we're going to use a Cinemachine track. This is a new kind of track available in Timeline once you download the Cinemachine package. So to set up Cinemachine, as you remember, if you went to the Cinemachine workshop, you drag in the camera so it has access to the Cinemachine brain. And then we drag in the cameras to which we like to prioritize. And we'll see an interesting blend. We just added both of these cameras. And let's reduce this just so you can really see the effect. If we hit play, our first camera will start in one spot. Nothing will happen. After 2 seconds, it moves to the next. So it actually just shifted rotation there and position. Cool. So that's nice, but we actually want it to blend, right? So let's say this whole blend sequence is going to be about 4 seconds, and let's move the second camera pretty much over it, almost to the beginning, not quite the beginning, but pretty darn close. And let's tighten it up by making it, reducing the end of the second camera. And look at the camera's behavior now. We've now created this interpolation behavior by blending the two virtual cameras, and this is what we call a camera blend. Blending the two cameras together. We're creating that panning behavior. I'm going to clear these. Okay, great. So how do we now combine this with the takeoff? If we were to hit play right now, the camera or everything would start, the takeoff sequence would begin, and then our cameras would interpolate while it's taking off. So that's not exactly what we want. But notice that we call this the master timeline. And we called it the master timeline because we would like other timelines to live inside of it. And that's how we can create different sequences within an animated sequence, within a timeline. So again, we saw in the beginning example, a ton of different behaviors happening at once. And the way we are able to achieve that is by creating these control tracks and then adding a timeline directly inside. And now, guys, because we added the timeline, we dragged in this first timeline, which I'm going to rename to takeoff timeline, game object. Now we know that we would like this timeline sequence to begin approximately at second 4. So again, we'll do a quick test. And I promise we're going to break in just a moment. Awesome. So it looks like it's working as we expected. Okay. So let's add one more virtual camera. And let's just move this thing back. We're going to rotate it a little bit, but you'll see we don't actually need to. Let's move it back. And let's drag this new camera onto the others and begin interpolating. Actually, we want to duplicate this first camera as well so that we have the starting point. So again, the goal here is to start looking at the camera, and then we want to end further back, which is why we have that blend. So now that's why we're moving these cameras back and forth. So we have our first camera at the top, realign those, and then a second camera that will now adjust back here. And we're going to follow the same sequence, and that will blend the two together. Okay, so now this is where things get a little interesting, because we would like to set the look at function. We want these cameras to stay locked on the rocket as it takes off. So let's go ahead and drag this rocket into our look at. And then hit play and see how it works. Cool. So it looks like things are working out for us. That's the target. That's our look at. You can see the yellow here is our target specifically. So we need to update those particles. Those particles are a little messed up, as you can clearly see. You'll also notice that we need to elongate our third camera. At least until the end of the camera, or excuse me, until the end of the timeline. Cool. So that's the intended behavior. And I want to make sure we get through all of our content before the end. It's 10:42. We don't have that much more time. We're going to pause, though, and we're going to go 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, just to make sure everybody who's following along has a chance to catch back up. Before we hop back into our deck, we'll go over the fade to black transitions as well. And then just based off of time, we're going to tidy things up there. We'll dive into some of the next steps, some of the additional resources. But for now, let's go ahead and work for the next 2 or 3 minutes. I'm also going to go ahead, I'll drop a poll. So looking back through the chat here, seeing a ton of enthusiasm. It's so exciting to see how people are applying this. I mean, we see one comment here. I mean, we see Cinemachine being used in the enterprise space, again, for training applications. Obviously not interactive tools necessarily, so the instructional design may be slightly hindered, but as a narrative tool, as a storytelling tool, as an instructional tool, so exciting to see that. Really, really powerful. Oh, interesting. So there was some interaction. Oh, great! Wow, I'd love to follow up, Amanda, because that sounds sounds very cool. Cool, guys. All right, so we are pretty much at our time, guys. These are lightning lessons. We're moving at a lightning pace. Some workshops can move a little slower just based off of the content. This particular workshop has a ton of content because, again, the feature's really deep. The tool's really deep. But it's also really exciting to work through it. So it's a fun one to learn. So let's go ahead and let's talk about those transitions. I'm going to go ahead and I'll hop back into the old deck. And as you can see in this slide, we'll dive into fade transitions. So what exactly does that mean? Again, we're using the same GIFs the whole time, but pay attention to that fade to black. How exactly do we create that fade to black? When we were first getting started with all of our development projects, we were literally using a script to do this, a nice LERP method as well. But you really don't need to. I mean, you can just have a nice black image right in front of the camera, and then you can just animate that on and off. Especially with the animation just being so friendly to use with timeline, you don't need to lean on the developers for a feature like fade to black. You can just use your artists who are proficient with Unity, who understand the basics of animation and UI. So as you can see here, we have that fade in, fade out. So let's go ahead and create those assets. Here I am, hopping out of present every single time. All right, make sure we're saving along the way before Unity crashes. Naturally, it would, given that I'm in front of 130 people now, it would actually crash. So let's go ahead and add a UI. So just drop down and add an image. It doesn't need to be special, just add an image, and then we're going to expand it across. So Let's see, I believe it's Shift Control. Now it's Shift Alt. Shift Alt to expand, so now it's just white. But we want black, so let's change that image to black. So the image now expands. Because the UI, the canvas, is in screen space, we don't need to position it in our world. Right? There's the, oh, jeez. Uh-oh. Bear with me here. Spazzing in Unity. So we have our image in this massive image in this screen space, but again, it's just the perfect size for what we need. So again, how do we create that nice fade in, fade out? Well, we could create several, oh, looks like people aren't getting, oh, apologies, guys. Yeah, sorry about that. For those of you who have been in my workshops before, that happens about once a session. Big apologies. We're back. Forgot to share. So I just added an image. I changed the image. Let me just do it again. So again, we're creating the fade. So UI, image. Let's make that image black. And let's go to these anchor presets and Shift, Alt, expand across. So now it expands across the entirety of my screen rather than just the black there. Oops. Cool. So now we have that. So we can do a few things here. We can create a fade timeline and then pull that in and embed that timeline, or we can just directly animate the image as needed. So let's keep it simple. Let's just animate the image as needed, so we don't need to create more timeline assets and confuse everybody. So now we just drag in the image to create an animation track. Let's hit play. And remember, at the beginning, we actually want the alpha. We're going to animate the alpha. Drop all the way down. So we start at 0, move in. And let's say that we want to start a fade, approximately here. I mean, it just feels right. We still have the recording going. Let's go ahead and bump that alpha back up. Oh, excuse me. We just want a keyframe. So we can just right-click on color. If I didn't modify, I would have said add key, but add key. Then at the end, before it transitions, that's when we want everything to move back. So let's go ahead and update the alpha so we're at 255 again. So now you can see we have a nice fade. See our fade, wait for it, boom. We have a fade. Cool. Okay, but now we need things to turn back on. So let's go ahead and do just that. We'll add another key. Add key. And by second 5, we want things to be mellowed out. We want to be back. So reduce the alpha. So now let's give it a play. Let's just make sure it's working properly. Fades down, fades up. Cool. And just like that, it's taking off. Awesome. So how can we expand on this? Again, we're going to do the classic. Let's break for a little bit here. And then we're going to dive into some closing thoughts and next steps and all that. But how can we expand? You just saw a fraction of what the project is on Learn. So first of all, make sure that you can get through that Learn project. All of the steps to build the whole project are in that Learn challenge, plus additional resources revolving around the different topics. So plenty of resources there. Naturally, you can continue to create more Cinemachine cameras. I also encourage you to play around with this dollying track. The dollying track, you can effectively set up a bunch of waypoints around the scene, and then you can move the camera around, so and you can animate between those waypoints, very similar to blending between the virtual cameras. So I'm actually going to delete these now. We could set up more cameras. We could have a camera moving up, slowly moving to the top, like we did in the demo. I mean, it's infinite potential around creativity with this tool. So just like the cinema world. So I encourage you guys in the next 3 minutes to go ahead and add some more virtual cameras, add some more fades between them, and then adjust those particle systems. Explore how we can adjust and fine-tune the liftoff particles. So as particles turn off, for instance, like these smoke effects, try to find the parameter in here that makes them fade over time rather than just turning off. So we're going to spend 2 minutes doing this, and then we're going to do one more demo, go back to the presentation, and then we're going to kill it from there. All right, so we're seeing a few questions just about the setup. One question about the particle effects, the other one about the image full screen. So remember with UI, if you're familiar with UI, you have these really handy anchor presets, right? This box here in the upper left. So again, I added an image. You can also right-click UI, image. You add the image by default. It's just going to be in the center. And these anchor presets are what can pull it across. So hold Shift and Alt and then find this anchor preset. And alternatively, we can use these anchor presets to connect and lock the image. And if you're building responsive applications, specifically in the mobile world, if you're building an application for iPad versus your mobile smartphone, for instance, then anchoring your UI and making your UI responsive becomes absolutely critical. So that's ultimately what these are for. It anchors the UI to the scene. So as your screen adjusts, so does the UI. But we also have this expand. You can just stretch it all the way across to keep things simple. And then from there, you just make it black. We have another question here in regards to particle effects. You can just add a particle effect. You can add it in, let's see, I believe it's light. No, it's not light, it's effects, particle system. And you'll find that the and particle system is also very deep. I'd love to run a workshop on particle systems. Hint, hint to some of the moderators, that is. You can just add a particle system here. You can rotate it. You can adjust its shape as well. If we go to shape, right now it's a cone. So we actually change the angle. So if it's like the blast off smoke kind of thing, we can change its size as well. So obviously now it's starting to be a little more like smoke. We can up its lifetime, so it's a little longer. Now we have something that resembles smoke. So again, more stuff. Or a tractor beam pulling up a rocket into space. So let's go ahead, before I get sidetracked, I realize it's, 11 o'clock, and, we're an hour, or we go like an hour over, and I'm still like enthusiastically rambling here. So let's go back to the presentation. There are a few bonus challenges that I highly, highly encourage you to do. Again, this is all on Learn. All the steps are outlined there too. So go ahead, spend some time and learn so that you learn how to set the next cutscene as the rocket leaves. Again, it's just another timeline. And if you explore that main scene, one of my favorite activities for learning is to download professional packages, like particle systems, for instance, coming off of the Unity Asset Store and just deconstructing it, finding which values they use, which keyframes they use to get the same effects. So I highly encourage you to look at our main scene and just deconstruct it from there. How many timelines do we use? How many timelines within timelines do we use? And from there, you can backstep and just try to replicate that or go on to Learn. These steps will be available to you, as I mentioned, so it'll give you a little bit of guidance there. And another challenge will be Mars, so activating Mars as you leave Earth and then move to Mars once you track it through space. So let's do a little wrap up. We only have a few more minutes. This will be another window for you as well. We will be sending an NPS survey. Please go ahead and take a little bit of time to do that. We'll have James send out, I believe James will, if you finish up this project, please record it and please submit it. I don't know if there's anything apart from Unity kudos and community ups if you do submit your trailer. However, we do have a folder and we will display that, your fine work. So really excited to see the different creative directions here. We've now gone through a few workshops around cinematography, and now it's time to make the final step. How do you combine everything you know in creating cutscenes with Timeline and Cinemachine? in a really high fidelity scene? And the answer is HDRP, or the high definition render pipeline. So this is a new pipeline specifically built for high definition content or high quality content. It maximizes graphical potential. You do need a bit of a machine, a good machine to run it, versus the universal render pipeline, which is geared for performance, specifically for mobile devices. But you'll be diving into the basics. How do you set it up? How do you just get started? Actually on Thursday, again with my colleague Andy. So May 7th, same time. We'd love to see you all there. I know it's going to be great. If you have any additional questions, leave it in the QA or follow up with me personally. Feel free to drop me a note at tim@kairosxr.com. I always get excited about continuing the conversation. So feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn as well. There's my bit.ly. Again, always excited to talk shop, answer any questions, and continue to talk about different applications for these tools. So anyways, that's it for our topics. A few minutes early. We're going to stick around. Let us know if you have any questions. But thank you all for coming, and we will talk to you very soon.